If you drive west out of Detroit on a gray Michigan morning, past the factories and the freeways and the sprawling suburbs that Henry Ford himself helped create, you will eventually find yourself on the banks of the Rouge River in Dearborn. The water moves slowly here. It always has, dark and deliberate, cutting through the heavy clay of the Midwest like a sentence that refuses to end. And if you know where to look, past the iron gates and through the ancient oak trees whose roots have been drinking from this same river for over 100 years, you will see it. A fortress, not a house, not a mansion, a fortress. 56 rooms of cold gray limestone rising from the riverbank like a fist raised against the sky. No warm light in the windows, no laughter drifting across the gardens, just silence, and the weight of a story that most people have never heard told completely. This is Fair Lane, the private world of Henry Ford, the man who gave the 20th century its shape, the man who took the automobile from the wealthy and handed it to the masses, the man who built the moving assembly line, who created the $5 workday, who turned a simple machine made of metal and rubber into the defining symbol of American freedom. And this is the story of what that man built when no one was watching. Not the factories, not the Model T, not the River Rouge complex with its steel mills and glass furnaces and its own deep-water port. This is the story of what he built for himself. The house on the river, the kingdom behind the gates, the place where Henry Ford, the most powerful industrialist in human history, came to be alone, and what that loneliness cost everyone around him. The name Fair Lane comes from a place in County Cork, Ireland, a narrow road in the village of Ballinascarthy, where Ford's ancestors once walked. Henry Ford never forgot where he came from. He carried that soil with him across the Atlantic and into the factories of Detroit, and eventually into the very name of the estate he would spend 30 years building into something the world had never seen before. Construction began in 1913. The architects who came and went from this project read like a who's who of American design. Frank Lloyd Wright himself was brought in for the initial plans, but Wright fled to Europe with his mistress, abandoning the project before the foundations were even poured. His assistant, Marion Mahoney Griffin, one of the first licensed female architects in America, stepped in and revised the design in her own interpretation of the prairie style. Then Henry and Clara Ford returned from a trip to Europe, looked at what she had done, dismissed her entirely, and brought in yet another architect to add English manor house details to the exterior. Henry Ford did not like to be told what his house should look like. By the time the 31,000-square-foot residence was completed in 1915, it had passed through the hands of 4 different architects and cost what would be roughly $30 million in today's money. It was a massive, severe structure that sat in its landscape like a declaration of war against the outside world. The walls were 4 feet thick in places. The rooms were arranged not for entertainment or for guests, but for function, for control. For the first time in his life, Henry Ford had built something that was entirely his. On a cold night in the autumn of 1915, the lights at Fair Lane flickered on for the first time. But these were not ordinary lights. Henry Ford didn't trust the city's power grid. He didn't trust the government's electricity. He had spent his entire career fighting bankers, politicians, and bureaucrats. He was not about to let any of them control the lights in his own home. Deep within the estate, connected to the main house by a damp 300-foot underground service tunnel, stood a 4-story powerhouse of limestone and iron, a cathedral of machinery. Thomas Alva Edison himself, Henry Ford's closest friend, his mentor, the man he admired above all others in the world, laid the cornerstone of that powerhouse in October 1914 with his own hands. Inside, two 55-kilowatt turbines hummed with a precision that Henry Ford found almost spiritual. The water from an 8-foot dam on the Rouge River drove them, and they generated enough electricity not just for the estate, but for a portion of the town of Dearborn itself. Henry Ford was not just self-sufficient. He was powerful enough to light up his neighbors. That powerhouse is the key to understanding everything that followed inside these walls. Because Fair Lane was not built for pleasure. It was not built for parties or for music or for the warm social life that other wealthy Americans of the Gilded Age demanded from their estates. It was built for one thing only: independence. Henry Ford wanted a world where he needed nobody, where every bolt of electricity, every vegetable on the table, every decision made within these walls answered only to him. He had spent his entire life in a battle with forces he could not fully control. Bankers who tried to seize his company, competitors who tried to undermine his patents, unions that threatened his factories, journalists who dissected his methods. He had fought them all. He had beaten them all. And now, at last, he had built himself a place where the gates could be locked, the tunnel sealed, and the world kept permanently outside. But you cannot lock out the darkness inside yourself. That is the truth Fair Lane kept for 30 years. To understand what happened inside the walls of this limestone fortress, you first have to understand the depth of Henry Ford's contradictions. Because they were not small contradictions. They were not the ordinary hypocrisies of powerful men. They were profound. They were consuming. And ultimately, they were catastrophic. Henry Ford built the modern world. He is arguably the man most responsible for the shape of 20th century civilization. The assembly line he perfected at the Highland Park plant in 1913 did not just change how cars were made, it changed how everything was made. The concept of mass production, of standardized parts, moving lines, specialized labor, spread from his factories to every industry on Earth. He didn't just sell automobiles, he rewrote the relationship between human beings and the machines they build. And yet, Henry Ford despised the modern world. He hated banks, calling them parasites feeding on honest labor. He hated cities, which he saw as corrupt and artificial and morally dangerous. He hated jazz music with a specific and documented intensity, declaring it a degenerating influence on American character. He hated Wall Street. He hated department stores. He hated the very transformation his own automobiles had set in motion, the urbanization, the mobility, the breakdown of rural community that the car inevitably brought with it. He wanted the world to look like the quiet Michigan farm where he was born in 1863, where his mother Mary cooked over a wood stove, where neighbors knew each other, where a man's worth was measured in what his hands could produce rather than what his portfolio could earn. But he had paved that world over with asphalt. He had replaced those farms with factories. He had sent the young men and women of rural America flooding into Detroit to work his assembly lines at $5 a day. He had killed the very world he longed for. At Fair Lane, he tried to build it back. He filled the 1,300-acre estate with bird sanctuaries. He planted wildflower meadows designed by Chicago landscape architect Jens Jensen, using what Jensen called the delayed view, a philosophy of landscape design where the visitor wanders through dense woodland for minutes before the house suddenly reveals itself in full, as if conjured from the trees. He built rustic cabins on the property where he could sit and pretend the factories did not exist. He invited school children to come and study birds and wildflowers on the grounds. He built Greenfield Village nearby, an obsessive recreation of 19th century American life, where he physically moved entire historic buildings from across the country to reassemble them in a kind of living museum. Thomas Edison's actual laboratory from Menlo Park, New Jersey, the courthouse where Abraham Lincoln had practiced law, the Wright brothers' bicycle shop from Dayton, Ohio. Henry Ford was literally trying to transport the past into the present. And the servants at Fair Lane walked on eggshells. The staff knew that Mr. Ford was watching. He would appear without warning in doorways, his pale blue eyes sharp and cold and measuring. He demanded absolute simplicity in the household, yet he lived in a 56-room castle with an indoor swimming pool, a bowling alley, and a private greenhouse that supplied his table year-round. He preached the virtue of hard work to anyone who would listen, yet he had hundreds of people working simply to maintain his personal comfort. He published a newspaper called the Dearborn Independent from 1919 to 1927, and in its pages he ran a vicious, sustained campaign of anti-Semitic propaganda, accusing Jewish people of controlling international finance, corrupting American culture, undermining the very values he claimed to champion. The series of articles was later compiled into a 4-volume collection called The International Jew. It was translated into 16 languages. Adolf Hitler kept a portrait of Henry Ford on his wall and cited him directly in Mein Kampf. The man who gave the world affordable transportation was also one of the most prominent disseminators of hatred in the 20th century. These are the contradictions that lived inside Fair Lane. But the deepest contradiction of all, the one that would eventually consume the Ford family entirely, had nothing to do with politics or factories or labor unions. It was about a father and a son. His name was Edsel Bryant Ford. Born November 6, 1893, in Detroit, the only child of Henry and Clara Ford. He was named, with touching sentiment, after Edsel Ruddiman, one of Henry Ford's closest childhood friends. The name was meant to carry the warmth of those farm years, the simple Michigan childhood that Henry Ford spent his entire adult life desperately trying to recover. Instead, the name Edsel Ford would come to represent something else entirely: the price of being a gentleman in a brutal empire. Edsel grew up inside the machine. He watched the empire rise from his earliest memories, from the kitchen table experiments to the Model T to the River Rouge complex. He understood the Ford Motor Company the way most children understand their neighborhoods, from the inside, with his whole body, from the age of 0. But what Edsel understood about automobiles was something his father never fully grasped. Henry Ford understood engines. He understood efficiency. He understood the mechanics of power. Edsel understood beauty. He had an instinctive, sophisticated grasp of design that his father completely lacked. He was the one who convinced Henry to buy the Lincoln Motor Company in 1922, understanding that Ford needed a presence in the luxury market. He was the one who pushed for hydraulic brakes, for modern body styling, for the visual language that would make a car feel like more than transportation. He founded the Mercury division. He commissioned Diego Rivera to paint the Detroit industry murals, one of the great masterpieces of 20th century American art, for the Detroit Institute of Arts. He financed Admiral Richard Byrd's expeditions to Antarctica. A mountain range on that frozen continent bears his name to this day, the Edsel Ford Range. He was brilliant. He was cultured. He was, by every account of everyone who met him, an uncommonly kind and gracious man. And in the Ford family, that kindness was treated as a disease to be cured. Henry Ford looked at his son's warmth, his gentleness, his love of art and design and people, and saw weakness. He saw a boy who had been born at the finish line, who had never known real struggle, who had never had to fight for anything in his life. And Henry, who had clawed his way up from a dirt farm to the pinnacle of industrial civilization through sheer, grinding will, was genuinely, bone-deep terrified that Edsel was too soft to hold the empire together after he was gone. He believed he was doing his son a favor. In 1919, Henry Ford staged a theatrical retirement. He announced that he was stepping down as president of the Ford Motor Company and handing the company to Edsel, who was just 25 years old. The press celebrated. A new era, they said, the young prince taking the throne. Edsel, with his bright eyes and his perfectly cut suits, looked like the future. He moved with his wife Eleanor into their own estate, Gawkler Point, a beautiful house designed by architect Albert Kahn on the shores of Lake St. Clair in Grosse Pointe Shores. It was everything Fair Lane was not. Light and elegant and filled with art, children's laughter, a home. But the retirement was a lie. Henry Ford had not stepped down. He had simply moved to the shadows. From the stone library at Fair Lane, he continued to pull every string. Every decision Edsel made was subject to silent reversal. Every executive Edsel promoted was vulnerable to a phone call from his father. Every building Edsel ordered constructed could be torn down the next morning on Henry's whim. There is a story, documented, verified, told by the engineers who witnessed it, of the day Edsel unveiled a 6-cylinder prototype engine that he and his team had been secretly developing for months. A smoother, more powerful design than the 4-cylinder engines Henry stubbornly loved. The engineers had labored over it. When it was finally finished, they set it gleaming on its stand. Henry Ford walked into the room. He looked at the engine. He said nothing. And then he began kicking it. Slowly, deliberately, with his heavy boots. Kicking the precision machinery until parts bent and snapped. Then he turned and walked out. No words were necessary. The message was hammered home as clearly as any assembly line memo. This empire belongs to me, not to you. Every Sunday, Edsel was expected to drive from Gawkler Point to Fair Lane for dinner with his parents. These Sunday dinners have been described by those who heard about them as something close to psychological torture. The dining room at Fair Lane was dim, Edison's bulbs throwing long shadows across the dark wood paneling. The food was simple and strange. Henry had developed a bizarre obsession with soybeans, convinced they held miraculous nutritional properties, and Clara's table often featured soybean bread, soybean milk, soybean ice cream. And across that table, Henry Ford would spend the meal methodically dismantling his son. He would criticize Edsel's clothes. Too expensive, too fashionable. He would mock Edsel's friends in Grosse Pointe, the wealthy social set that Edsel and Eleanor moved among. He would question Edsel's management decisions in front of the servants, in front of Clara, in front of anyone who happened to be present. And Edsel would smile. He would nod. He would absorb every blow with a grace that cost him everything. He loved his father. It is one of the most heartbreaking facts in American industrial history. Edsel Ford genuinely, deeply, unshakably loved Henry Ford. He did not fight back because he was not built for cruelty. He was built for decency. And he kept believing, right up until the end, that someday his father would look at him and simply say, "You are enough." Henry Ford never said it. But the Sunday dinners were not even the worst of it. In the 1930s, as the Great Depression ground America's working class into dust, as car sales collapsed and the workers who had once worshipped Henry Ford began standing in bread lines outside his gates, the man behind the Fair Lane walls made a decision that transformed the Ford Motor Company from an industrial empire into something darker. He needed a weapon. His name was Harry Herbert Bennett, born 1892 in Ann Arbor, Michigan, former boxer, former Navy sailor, 5 feet 6 inches of barely contained violence with a bow tie and a smile that never reached his eyes. The story of how they met is almost too perfect in its darkness. Bennett, barely out of the Navy, was involved in a street brawl in New York City, fighting multiple men at once, brutal and efficient, and utterly without mercy. A journalist who happened to witness the fight recognized something useful and brought Bennett along to a meeting with Henry Ford. Henry took one look at this small, vicious man and decided, "I need that." His interview for the job was reportedly brief. "Can you shoot?" Henry asked. Bennett could. He was hired for security. He stayed for 30 years, and in those 30 years he rose from factory enforcer to the second most powerful man in the Ford empire. More powerful in practice than Edsel Ford himself. Bennett headed what was called the Ford Service Department. The name sounds harmless, administrative, the kind of department that fixes broken copy machines. It was a private army. At its peak, Bennett commanded over 3,000 men. Ex-convicts, professional boxers, gang members recruited directly from the Detroit underworld. They dressed in suits and fedoras and walked the factory floors of the Rouge plant with dead eyes and heavy pockets. And their job was not to build cars or maintain order or resolve disputes. Their job was to make sure that Henry Ford's will was never questioned, and that anyone who tried to organize, to protest, to simply speak without permission was either fired or beaten. On March 7, 1932, during the depth of the Great Depression, a group of starving, unemployed workers staged what became known as the Ford Hunger March. They walked to the Rouge plant carrying signs asking only for jobs and food. Bennett's men opened fire on them with tear gas and live bullets. 4 workers were shot dead. Bennett himself was struck by a thrown rock and hospitalized. This was the Ford Motor Company in the 1930s. This was the world that Edsel Ford, as the nominal president of the company, was expected to manage and defend in public, while being systematically undermined behind the scenes by his own father. Bennett became Henry's confessor, his confidant, the son Henry had always wanted, the rough, violent, no-nonsense man of action that Henry saw in himself and could not see in Edsel. He would drive to Fair Lane daily, sometimes twice daily, to sit with the aging industrialist and feed his paranoia. Labor unions were communist plots. Wall Street bankers were circling. His own son was too weak to protect what mattered. And Henry believed every word. Bennett began to openly use his proximity to the old man as a weapon against Edsel. He would walk into Edsel's office unannounced, put his feet on Edsel's desk, and countermand official orders of the company's president with a casual contempt that was breathtaking in its brazenness. "Your father doesn't want that. We're canceling it." And when Edsel drove to Fair Lane to confront his father, Henry would shrug his shoulders and tell his son, "Harry knows what I want. You could learn something from him." The breaking point came on May 26, 1937. Walter Reuther and a group of United Auto Workers organizers gathered on a pedestrian overpass outside the River Rouge plant. They were there legally. They had brought photographers deliberately, anticipating what might happen. They planned to hand out leaflets. Bennett's men came through the factory doors like a wall. They threw their jackets over their heads to hide their faces and attacked. Reuther and his colleagues were beaten with clubs, kicked down staircases, thrown against concrete walls. The photographers captured every moment. The next morning, those images were on the front page of every newspaper in America. The Ford Motor Company, once the symbol of American democratic capitalism, the company that had given the working man a wage he could live on, was now a globally recognized symbol of corporate brutality. Edsel Ford read those newspapers at Gaukler Point and felt something change inside him that never came back. He drove to Fair Lane. He pleaded with his father. "The government is going to intervene," he said. "The public has turned against us. Bennett is destroying everything you built. You have to stop this." Henry Ford looked at his son and accused him of siding with the enemy. After that day, Edsel stopped arguing, not because he had given up, but because he had finally understood. His father was not living in the same reality as the rest of the world. Harry Bennett had built a wall around Henry Ford's mind just as thick and just as impenetrable as the limestone walls of Fair Lane. And Edsel Ford, trapped between his love for his father and the impossible demands of the outside world, began to disappear. The stress did not stay invisible for long. By the late 1930s, Edsel was suffering from severe stomach ulcers. He couldn't eat properly. He couldn't sleep. He grew thin. The color left his face. The doctors told him what anyone who knew his life could have told him. The source of the destruction was the daily, relentless, inescapable pressure of his existence. But he could not leave. He had 4 children. He had thousands of workers who depended on him being the sane, steady counterweight to his father's increasing paranoia. And he had something deeper still. The bone-level loyalty of a man who simply could not abandon his father, no matter what his father had done to him. When World War II came, and the United States government turned to the Ford Motor Company to build the arsenal of democracy, it was Edsel who answered the call, not Henry, who was by then too old, too paranoid, too mired in conspiracy theories to function effectively in the world of government contracts and military production. It was Edsel who envisioned and drove the construction of the Willow Run bomber plant, a facility so colossal that it had its own internal weather system, a mile long, covering over 3 million square feet of production floor, built to produce 1 B-24 Liberator bomber per hour. Edsel set that goal himself and drove his engineers toward it with everything he had left. He worked 16-hour days. He fought Bennett for every purchase order, every engineering decision, every piece of steel allocated to the war effort. He fought his father for the authority to run the company he was nominally president of. He fought the U.S. government's impatience with Ford's chaos. And all while the ulcers in his stomach were becoming something worse. By 1942, the diagnosis had changed. It was not ulcers. It was stomach cancer, metastatic, combined with undulant fever. His body, which had been absorbing the blows of a lifetime of psychological warfare, had finally begun to break down at the cellular level. When Henry Ford was told, he refused to believe it. He accused the doctors of exaggerating. He accused Edsel of seeking sympathy. He forbade surgery. He prescribed soybeans and raw vegetables and hard work as the cure. And Edsel, conditioned by 49 years of desperate love for this man, listened. He did not have the surgery. He went home to Gaukler Point, laid down in the house he had built with Eleanor, the house full of the art he loved and the light he had always sought, and prepared to die. On May 26, 1943, 6 years to the day after the Battle of the Overpass, Edsel Bryant Ford died. He weighed less than 120 pounds. He was 49 years old. The Ford workforce mourned him with a grief that was public and profound. Thousands lined up to pay their respects. Workers who had never met him wept openly, because Edsel Ford had been the one thing inside that empire that had still felt human. At Fairlane, the reaction was silence. Henry Ford received the news with a stillness that those present described as almost inhuman. He did not collapse. He did not weep publicly. He turned his attention, with the immediate practicality of a man who had spent 60 years thinking only about survival, to the question of what happened next to the company. He reappointed himself as president. It was a catastrophe. He was 80 years old. He had suffered multiple strokes. His memory came and went like interference on a radio signal. The company lost nearly $10 million a month under his renewed leadership. War contracts were at risk. The Roosevelt administration discussed, in serious terms, whether the U.S. government should nationalize the Ford Motor Company, seize it from the family entirely, to ensure that bomber production did not stop. The man who had once been more powerful than the U.S. Treasury was now a problem that the U.S. government was considering solving by force. The salvation of the Ford empire did not come from a boardroom. It did not come from a brilliant executive or a government intervention or a Wall Street rescue. It came from two women who had spent decades watching the tragedy from the margins and who had finally had enough. Clara Bryant Ford, Henry's wife, the woman who had stood beside him since 1888, who had believed in him when no one else did, who had worked the farm with him and watched the first engine run on the kitchen table and endured 30 years inside Fairlane with her husband's demons. She had tried for years to soften Henry, to get him to release Edsel from the psychological vice. Henry had ignored her. But Clara Ford had one power her husband could not override. She held a massive block of Ford Motor Company stock. And so did Eleanor Ford, Edsel's widow, the woman who had watched her husband be slowly killed by the combined weight of his father's cruelty and Harry Bennett's malice. The woman who, on the day Edsel died, held in her hands Edsel's non-voting stock, all of it donated by Edsel through his will to the Ford Foundation he and his father had established together. They met with Henry. The conversation was brief. "Step down. Hand the company to your grandson, Henry Ford II, or we sell." Selling meant Wall Street, meant banks, meant the end of family control, meant the bankers Henry Ford had spent his entire life despising would inherit everything he had built. He stepped down. Henry Ford II, 28 years old, heavy-set like his grandfather, but with the warmer eyes of his father, was pulled out of naval service and handed the keys to the most troubled large company in America. On September 21, 1945, he walked into the Ford Motor Company as its new president. His first act was to summon Harry Bennett. The meeting was short. John Bugis, the FBI agent Henry II had brought in to help him clean house, handed Bennett his termination. Bennett and Bugis actually drew pistols on each other in the office. But the power had already shifted, and Bennett knew it. He told Henry Ford II, "You're taking over $1 billion company that you haven't contributed a thing to." Then he left, went to his basement office, burned his files, walked out of the River Rouge complex for the last time. His 30-year reign of fear was over in an afternoon. When Henry Ford II went to tell his grandfather what he had done, he braced himself for an explosion. Henry Ford simply said, "Well, now Harry is back on the streets where he started." Henry Ford retreated to Fair Lane, permanently this time. The last 2 years of his life were spent inside the limestone walls he had built to protect himself from the world. He wandered the gardens, watching the river. He visited Greenfield Village, his outdoor museum of 19th century American life, losing himself in the reconstructed past. He stopped driving the automobiles he had given to the world and returned to using a horse-drawn carriage. The man who had dragged civilization into the modern age rode through his private estate in a vehicle from 1870. On the night of April 7, 1947, a massive spring storm struck Dearborn, Michigan. The Rouge River, the same river that had been flowing beneath Henry Ford's windows for 32 years, flooded its banks. The waters rose higher than they had in decades. They crept across the grounds of Fair Lane in the darkness. They reached the powerhouse that Thomas Edison had laid the cornerstone of with his own hands in 1914. The cathedral of turbines and limestone that Henry Ford had built so he would never, not for a single moment, have to depend on anyone else for his light. The floodwaters reached the turbines. The turbines stopped. The power went out. Inside the 56-room limestone fortress, in a cold, dark bedroom on the south side of the house where Edison himself had once stayed as a guest, the richest man in the history of the American automobile industry lay dying. The central heating failed. The electric lights failed. The servants lit oil lamps and candles and gathered at the bedside. Henry Ford died of a cerebral hemorrhage at 11:40 that night. He was 83 years old. The man who had electrified the world died in darkness, in candlelight, in the cold, in the same kind of room he had been born in 83 years earlier on a Michigan farm, illuminated by the same flickering flame that had lit the farmhouse of his childhood. His powerhouse, his monument to absolute self-sufficiency, to independence, to the refusal to ever need anyone for anything, had failed him in the only hour that mattered. Fair Lane stands today, a National Historic Landmark, preserved behind its iron gates and its ancient trees, open to the public as a house museum where visitors walk the hallways and look at the furniture and read the placards and try to imagine the life that happened here. It does not feel like a home. Every visitor says so. It feels like something between a museum and a prison. The ceilings are high and the rooms are dim, and the limestone walls absorb the light rather than reflecting it. The landscape, despite Jensen's genius, is melancholy. The bird sanctuaries are quiet now. The Ford family still exists. Henry Ford II rebuilt the company and drove it successfully through the second half of the 20th century. Edsel's grandchildren sit on the boards of museums and foundations and carry the name into the 21st century. But Fair Lane carries a different kind of legacy. It is the record of what happens when a man confuses power with wisdom and control with love. Henry Ford understood, with a precision that bordered on genius, exactly how to manufacture a product that the world wanted. He understood tolerances and efficiencies and the mathematics of production at a level that no one before him had ever approached. What he never understood was how to manufacture nothing. Not silence, not trust, not the simple act of looking at his son, his brilliant, gracious, extraordinary son, and saying the words that cost nothing to say and meant everything to receive. I am proud of you. He built an empire that changed the course of civilization. He built a fortress on a river to keep the world at bay. He built a powerhouse to generate his own light. He built a museum to keep the past alive. And he could not build the one thing that Edsel needed. The story of Fair Lane is not a story about factories or assembly lines or the birth of modern industry. It is a story about the most common human failure in the world, the failure of a father to see his son. You can conquer markets. You can accumulate a fortune that rivals nations. You can drag the entire human race into the future, whether it wants to come or not. But you cannot engineer love out of fear. You cannot mass-produce approval. And you cannot, no matter how many rooms you build, no matter how thick you make the walls, no matter how long you keep the turbines running, you cannot outrun the simple, devastating truth that the people you fail in private become the haunting of everything you built in public. Fair Lane still stands, Henry Ford still watches from the walls, and Edsel still waits, somewhere in the silence between the limestone and the river, for the word his father never gave him.